slide should go. There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. So hopefully if I did everything right, I've got my lovely live audience in front of me, and I have a Zoom audience, and I have a Facebook Live audience. It looks like everything connected right this time. So I'm still trying to get the hang of all the technology here. But today we're going to be talking about the driving of the last spike. And we'll just start by acknowledging the land traditions and culture of the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Okanagan Nation Alliance. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So this is a huge topic, obviously. And on the table here in the room, I have a display of several books about the subject. It is the subject of a lot of research and writing. Probably one of the more notable is The Last Spike by and the National Dream by P.R. Burton. But there's also some other really excellent books. One is called Van Horn's Road by Omer Lavallee, who was the former CP rail archivist. So as I say, it's a huge topic. I'm just going to focus on a few aspects of it, the aspects that I personally find interesting and have the time to put the research and photographs together for today. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about first was the fact that there were probably 15,000 or so Chinese laborers involved in the construction of the railway between Port Moody and Craigellachie. They only worked on that section of the line because it would have been too difficult and too expensive to get them the other side of the line into Rogers Pass or in the eastern part of the construction. So they worked solely on that part of the line. The contracts were for that area were under the control of a man named Andrew Onderdonk, and he actually acquired the contracts before the Canadian Pacific Railway Company had been formed. So he was an independent contractor who was doing that section of the line, and so his job was to meet up with the contractors coming from the east across the Selkirks. So as I say, Onderdonk was the only contractor that hired Chinese laborers. It was very controversial. A lot of the businessmen, especially in Victoria, were very much against the hiring of Chinese laborers, and they protested about it quite loudly. Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, said that if you don't have the Chinese labor, you can't have the railway. Basically saying that there wasn't enough labor available especially in British Columbia, to work on the line at that time, and they had to bring in the Chinese laborers. It was a difficult job. There's estimates that between 600 and 2,000 of the Chinese workers died during construction. And when I started researching this topic several years ago, I thought, well, surely the records will be there because every death in the province was required to be registered. And so I started reading the newspapers that were coming out of Yale at that time, the Inland Sentinel newspaper, and it would have an account saying so many, like 3 Chinese men died in the blasting of a tunnel today. And I'd go on to the vital events register on the Provincial Archives site, thinking that those names would be there and the records would be there. They were not. You'd go into the same paper and there'd be John Smith had died during construction of the railway today. You'd go in, his records were there. So it's impossible to tell that number. Even if you look at 600, that's a huge amount of people that died. But the estimates are that it was probably more. The Chinese workers were paid about half of what the European Caucasian workers were paid. They were housed in segregated housing, usually just in tents, whereas there was often like rough wooden houses made for the other workers. There was one winter in a lot of the men were living near Hope, and there was several cases of Chinese men dying of scurvy over the winter, as they just didn't have access to food. They weren't being paid over the winter. So that's a whole story in itself. But I think it's important to acknowledge that part of the history and the building of the railway. The Major Rogers was given the job of locating the routes for the railway through the mountains, and he is credited with locating the line through Kicking Horse Pass in 1881 and Rogers Pass in 1882. He was, at some point I should probably do a talk just on Rogers and his exploration. He was quite a character himself. He was given the nickname Hell's Bells Rogers because he was prone to really colorful language. He didn't treat his workers very well at all, particularly the Indigenous workers. He had a constitution where he didn't need to eat a lot, so he didn't think anybody else needed to eat a lot either. So he didn't provide a lot of food for the men working for him. He did have those pretty magnificent mustache. So I'm going to show this. This is a cartoon by the amazing Rob Buchanan. It's probably one of my favorite cartoons that he's done. And it's what if Major Rogers took Mr. Rogers to discover Rogers Pass? And Mr. Rogers is saying, it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. And Major Rogers says, pass me more dang spitting tobacco. And Mr. Rogers says, would you like to be my friend, Major Rogers? Major Rogers says, pass. But as I say, that's a whole story in itself about the location of the pass. And there was a lot of dispute even back then about whether they should be building the pass through or building the railway through the mountains here, or whether they should look for either more northerly or more southerly route that wasn't having to deal with the mountains. But as we all know, they did choose the routes through Kicking Horse Pass and Rogers Pass, and it was obviously a huge amount of work to do that. A man named James Ross was the main contractor in charge of the building through the Selkirks. In the spring of 1885, there was still very deep snow on the ground, and they were trying to proceed with the bridge projects when the men went on strike. The cash position of the CPR was at an all-time low at that point. They were pretty close to bankruptcy from the costs of building the railway, and by that spring they were not in a position to have ready cash flow, and most of the men hadn't been paid for 3 months. So they had a bit of a walkout and a strike, and there was about 1,000 of the 2,500 men who were working at the time who refused to work, and some of them walked from Rogers Pass to Beavermouth, and had a little bit of a confrontation there. We've got an account from a man named P. Turner Bowen, who was a civil engineer who worked on a lot of the bridge contracts in the pass. And he was saying that they were trying to take his men off of the bridge work, and they were finally able to persuade some of them to go. But when they got to Beavermouth, Colonel Sam Steele of the newly minted Northwest Mounted Police was there, and he and his officers were the ones that were managed to calm the men down. There's one story that Steele was actually in bed with Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and he got up out of his bed to go and deal with these striking workers. It said that Ross actually paid the men, or at least some of them, out of his own cash on hand, and then they dealt with that later. That incident really spurred the Dominion government to take the claims from the Canadian Pacific Railway seriously and offer them the ability to sell an issue of stock. That was when George Stephen went to England looking for purchasers for the stock issue and persuaded Edward Baring, the head of the Barings Bank in England, to purchase the stock. And Edward Baring had just been raised to the peerage and was given the name Lord Revelstoke. So that's where we got our name from, was from Lord Revelstoke dealing at the CPR. But anyway, they returned to work, and work continued on. Ross had realized that some of the line, as originally surveyed by Rogers, was impractical due to the avalanche paths, and he actually had men stationed in the pass during the winter of 1884 and 1885, determining where some of the more active slide paths, avalanche paths were. So I was mentioning this book, When the Steel Went Through, by Peter Turner Bone. He was a civil engineer who was born in Scotland and came out to Canada and was working as an engineer, mostly on the bridges in the Rockies and Selkirk. When they got into the Rogers Pass area in the Selkirks, there were so many bridges that had to be built in a short period of time that they actually got 3 engineers working on overseeing the construction of the bridges. One of the bridges that Bone was in charge of was the Mountain Creek Bridge, which was 1,200 feet long and 150 feet high. It was the largest of all the bridges in regard to the amount of timber that was required. It consisted of a central span of 150 feet, flanked at each end by 2 smaller truss spans of 30 feet each, and by a number of trestle and pile bents 15 feet apart. Bone says in his book that James Ross, the main contractor, came to inspect the work. Bone said there were some planks of the staging underneath the deck still in place. Seeing these, he wanted to get down to them to make some inspection there. To do this, he squeezed his body through the deck between the ties, but he could get no further. He looked up to me and laughed and said he couldn't get his head through. He did manage to get out eventually, but they had a bit of a laugh over that. So you can just imagine the job it was to build these bridges without any mechanical apparatus or anything else. Just a huge amount of work, and the amount of wood that went into these bridges too was pretty phenomenal. So the summit of the Selkirks was reached on August 17th, 1885. Bone said getting down on the western slope of the Selkirks was a problem. And there was one of the engineers said Sammy Sykes had for some time been endeavoring to solve it, and he has succeeded. He located a line which came to be known as the Loop. It consisted of a series of loops winding back and forth across a number of streams until it had got down to practically the level of the Illecillewaet River. Bone said it was to the loop that I made my next move. This meant abandoning our comfortable log house and getting back into tents. There were 5 bridges, mostly fairly high trestles, comprised in this series of loops. Most of these bridges were on curves. The building of the bridges comprised in the loop went ahead at a rapid pace, and so did the laying of the track. It kept close on the heels of the bridge carpenters. At one of these bridges, I remember seeing the track layers commence laying the track at one end, just as the carpenters were finishing their work at the other. On September 28, 1885, Onderdonk, who was doing the western contract, ran out of rails 2 miles west of the North Fork of the Eagle River on the west slope of Eagle Pass. Ross's crews were 43 miles to the east, about 5 miles west of Albert Canyon by that time. The picture showing one of the construction crews. Most of the men who were working on that end had followed the railway construction west all the way across the country. A lot of men had come up from the United States and were following construction across, especially from Minnesota. There were a lot of immigrants from Sweden who had immigrated to Minnesota, and a lot of them crossed the line and followed across. It's where we got families in Revelstoke like the Abrahamsons and the Stones, and some of the early Swedish families that were just really basically following the construction across. A lot of people, as well as working for the railway, some of them started going into doing bakeries and hotels as the work was traveling across. So that's where like both the Abrahamson and the Stone families started running hotels and then eventually established hotels here. Frank McCarty and his wife had also come up from the States, and he was actually supplying meat to the crews as they went across Canada, and then he eventually settled in Revelstoke and had a butcher business here. So the construction of the CPR bridge at Revelstoke in 1885, and this bridge was completed in October of that year. And I'm not 100% sure that this photograph was taken during construction or whether this was taken a little later than that. There maybe somebody in my audience will know whether this would have been an 1885 photograph. But there's rather interesting, if you look right in the middle of the photograph, you can see that there's, looks like they've got sort of a little plank there that they're throwing things off, and you can see the splash in the water there. They've pushed something off of the bridge there. So by November 5th, there was only 3.5 miles left of track left to construct. We have an account of a lot of the building during that time by this fellow, Edward Mallandane, who looks about 12, but is actually 17 years old in that photograph. And this is a little taken this zoomed in from the driving of the last spike photograph. He was born in Victoria. His father was an educated man, I believe an engineer, civil engineer. But Mallandane at the age of 17 was a bit restless and wanted to have an adventure. So he left home and made his way out as far as Eagle Pass Landing or Sycamoose, and then Farwell, which is now Revelstoke, or it was probably even there when it was still being called Second Crossing for the second time that the bridge crossed the Columbia River. His goal was to eventually get to Manitoba and fight in the Riel Rebellion. But by the time he got out here, that was pretty much over. So he was able to get a little contract taking supplies between Farwell and Eagle Pass Landing. Of course, it was just a really rough tote road there. It involved having to ford creeks a few times, rivers. But he did that for a few months and decided that it was worthwhile sticking around to be at the ceremony for the driving of the last spike. So he describes the trip to Craigellachie. Says, on the evening of November 6th, several of us left Farwell on a train consisting of an engine and tender and 3 flat cars loaded with rails, the last train to load rails for Craigellachie. A cold, cheerless, rough ride we had. Shortly after leaving Farwell, it began to snow. This made the rails slippery, and when we reached the big gumbo slide or grade, we were unable to get over it. And after 3 attempts, in each of which the train would run back on itself, we were obliged to cut off one car. Then we managed to make it over the grade. Far into the darkness of the night we traveled, shivering with cold, lying down on top of the steel rails, unable to sleep, almost shaken to pieces, as the train traveled slowly over the unballasted and rough roadbed. Finally, it came to an end. It was pitch dark, and we were able to get off, and after a great deal of difficulty, we managed to snatch a short sleep in a vacant boxcar. All through the night, the rails were laid from both east and west, and early the following morning, November 7th, we were astir, watching the rails gradually approaching each other. The next day, the train carrying Van Horn, Donald Smith, Sanford Fleming, John Egan, and some family members arrived at the scene as the 2 final lengths of rail were being cut to complete the main line. The cut rails were put in place and lightly spiked. The last spike was to be driven at the rail join connecting the rails from the east and those from the west. Shortly after 9 o'clock, everyone took their place, with Major Rogers holding the tie against the rail with a bar. Arthur Pierce, Van Horn's assistant, looked at his watch. It was 9:22 Pacific time. Mallandane continued. Soon there remained but a single rail to be laid. The distance was measured. It was discovered that the rail was about 3 feet too long, and while this was being shortened, Sir Donald Smith and his party came on the scene. They watched the proceedings in readiness to drive the last spike. Then the rail was laid. The spectators, numbering probably 50 outside of the workmen, intently watched each spike as it was driven. Finally, there remained but one more spike to be driven. It was partly driven in, and a hammer was given to Sir Donald Smith to drive it home. And Mallandane continued. Before doing so, 3 photographs were taken by a little humpbacked photographer named Ross, of Ross, Best and Company, Winnipeg. One when Sir Donald had the hammer over his shoulder, preparatory to striking, one with the hammer over his head, and one with the hammer on the nail head. Then he quickly and in a most workmanlike manner drove the spike home. Everybody cheered, the locomotives whistled and shrieked. Several short speeches were made, hands were shaken, and Major Rogers, the discoverer of the past named after him, became so gleeful that he upended a huge tie and tried to mark the spot by the side of the track by sticking it in the ground. Thus was the Dominion of Canada bound together by bands of steel reaching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And now there's a few discrepancies in other accounts. Of course, there's kind of more famously known that Donald Smith missed the first time, or he bent the spike the first time it went in. And so somebody quickly took out the original spike and gave him another one to try again. According to, this is from The Last Spike by Pierre Burton, said this when he hammered the spike halfway home and bent it badly with his first blow, the Frank Brothers, the roadmaster, expecting such an emergency, pulled it out and replaced it with another. Pierre Burton talks in his book about the fact that, that when they had the Northern Pacific Railway laid in the United States, they had a huge ceremony that cost over $175,000, and they actually had a golden spike there. But the CPR was in no position to have anything so elaborate. So there was really not a lot of speeches. Sir Donald Smith said the work has been well done in every way. It was really very low key. But you can see there's quite a crowd there. And I have some identification of some of the people. This identification was provided to me by Alex Price, who's passed away a few years ago, but he was quite an amazing very knowledgeable about the railway and a collector. So he was able to identify some of the key people in the photograph. I talked about James Ross. He's identified as a person under the letter S in that photograph. Sir Sanford Fleming is E, the guy with the big tall hat and the very impressive beard. And there's Van Horn there. Major Rogers was there. He's actually the person that has this pole up against the tie to hold it in place, but you can't actually see him. He's kind of hidden in the crowd, but he was there at the ceremony. So this photograph was taken after the ceremony. The young fellow, Benny Van Horn, who was the son of William Cornelius Van Horn, and playing with a spike maul after the ceremony, and some of the wives of the officials in the back of the car. There was a group of railway workers at Donald, which is just this side of Golden, and they were waiting for a work train to take them back east. So they had their own little, very unofficial ceremony, quite some ways away from Craigellachie. Pierre Burton talks about the name Craigellachie. He said that it was in common use among the CPR syndicate directors when they were forming it in 1880. George Stephen, Burton says one of the members of the syndicate balked at the idea of a major railway venture such as the Canadian Pacific Railway. And George Stephen had replied with that one word, Craigellachie, a reference to a Scottish poem beginning with the phrase, "Not until Craigellachie shall move from his firm base." And when he heard of that incident, Van Horn decided that would be what they would call the spot where the last spike was driven. When the first spike was taken out after being bent, it was chopped into pieces, and there were pieces of jewelry that were made of some of the pieces of that spike. And I think it actually is in one of the museums in Ottawa at this point. But in 10 years ago, in 2010, on the 125th anniversary of the driving of the last spike, I was privileged to be one of the several people that got to go to the ceremony by train. And one of the people in the car was, I can't remember if he was a relative of George Stephen or one of the other directors, but he actually had the brooch that was made for his family member from the piece of spike and was passing it around. It was quite an amazing little piece. There was, as you can see in the photograph, there was a lot of people there other than the officials. And I've actually had quite a few people contact me over the years saying that their family members were there. And you'd read the newspapers in the 1920s and 30s and 40s when there'd be obituaries of old timers that would often say so-and-so had been at the driving of the last spike. So it was considered a real badge of honor if you were at that event. One of the people who was there was George Patrick, and he's right at the front of the engine here. He was a quite amazing career railway engineer. He was born just east of Montreal in 1854 and came to St. Boniface in 1878 and began his railway career as a brakeman on the Pembina branch of the CPR, which was the first railway from the south into what became Manitoba. He started as a fireman running out of St. Boniface. In 1881, he began working as a locomotive engineer on construction work during the building of the main line of the CPR. He worked all the way from Fort William to Craigellachie, and he was there at the driving of the last spike. After the railway was completed in November of 1885, he went home to Montreal for the winter. And in June of 1886, when the first passenger train left Canmore for the west over the reopened railway, Lou Patrick was the engineer as far as Donald. He remained on the run on passenger trains in this area for 32 years. He later did the run from Revelstoke to Field on the Imperial Limited run. And for a lot of his career, he had engine 592. In December of 1916, he brought the first passenger train through the newly constructed Connaught Tunnel. The last 18 months of his railway career were spent on the Arrowhead branch line. It was said that he had a unique whistle on his engine. When he was coming into Revelstoke, he gave a toot on his whistle, and that gave his wife enough time to get a meal ready before he got home. Whether that's an apocryphal story or not, I'm not sure, but it's a good story. Retired in 1919 and moved to Vancouver, where he died in 1942 at the age of 89. So quite a really remarkable career. It's maybe one day I can do another talk just on people who were at the driving of the last bike, because there were some pretty remarkable stories there too. So after the ceremony, there was still a lot of work to be done. They couldn't run passenger trains yet. There was still a lot of work that needed to be done, fixing tracks. This is doing summer and winter tracks in Rogers Pass in 1886. Over the winter, again, they had people who were stationed in Rogers Pass determining the avalanche paths, and that helped them determine where the snow sheds should be built. So a lot of that work was happening in 1886 as well. The construction crew in one of the snow sheds. So it wasn't until the summer of 1886 that the first through passenger train came over the new line. It left Montreal on June 28, 1886, with a connecting train from Toronto meeting it, and it arrived in Port Moody on July 4th, 1886. The total time was 139 hours for that first trip. Look, another picture of the Pacific Express train in those early days when they were first running the trains through. So an early cairn was built at Craigellachie to mark the spot where the last bike was driven. Not sure when this one was first put up there, but this picture would have been taken sometime in the 1920s. And in 1927, it was replaced by the stone cairn that's there now. And that was built by Joe Parasini, who was a stonemason for the CPR. And Joe Parasini had come to Revelstoke in about 1903 with a group of other Italian stonemasons. They came here from northern Italy, from the Italian Alps. They were all trained stonemasons. One of them was Joe Parasini. One of the others was Anselmo Pratolini. And Pratolini went into business for himself after a few years. And of course, he is known for his castle home on 2nd Street, as well as being one of the main contractors for the courthouse, and of course, and quite a few other buildings in town. But as I say, Joe Parasini stayed working for the CPR as a stonemason for the rest of his career. He also built the cairn in memory of Farwell that is located at the courthouse. That's also one of Parasini's markers. In 1985, for the centennial of the driving of the last bike, they raised the cairn and put a new base under it. And it had a stone from each province and territory embedded into the base. And on the fourth side was a large stone of granite from Craigellachie, Scotland. And they replaced the original plaque on the side of the cairn as well. It was unveiled on November 7th, 1985 by Lord Strathcona, who was the great grandson of Donald Smith. And it was also by Lord Shaughnessy, who was the grandson of Thomas Shaughnessy, one of the CPR directors. In 1985, when they had the 100th anniversary ceremony out there, afterwards, Ruby had gone out for that, but I was still a bit too junior to get invited along for that. But after the ceremony, they came into town and this bus pulled up outside the museum, and this busload of railway historians and railway directors and all these important people came into the museum. It was probably one of the most terrifying moments of my career because they were all asking me questions that they knew the answer to, but I didn't. But it was pretty amazing. Omer LaValle, who the CPR archivist, was one of them. I was actually quite delighted to meet him. He was quite an incredible man. What he knew about the CPR was just amazing. One of the other things they did in the summer of 1985 is they had a special ceremony in Revelstoke as well. And they actually had a spur line to Queen Elizabeth Park, and they brought an old steam engine up to Queen Elizabeth Park. This was another plaque that was placed in 1958 at Craigellachie. That was BC's centennial year, commemorating the year that the 100th anniversary of when British Columbia became a crown colony. So there was a lot of historic monuments and things that were placed that year. So that one was put up at that time. There's been a lot of reenactments over the years. The Kinsmen did a few different reenactments during the Golden Spike Days events that they held in the 1940s. And of course, they called their events Golden Spike Days, but the spike that was put there to complete the railway was not golden. It was just a regular iron spike. But Golden Spike was too good of a name not to use. So the local events were called Golden Spike Days. And in the 1944 reenactment, the boy who was portraying Edward Mallandane was Louis Davis. And there's a picture of him shaking hands with Mallandane, who came to Revelstoke for the 1944 ceremonies. Mallandane had a distinguished career during the First World War, became a colonel, and he ended up actually being the founder of the town of Preston. So that's where he lived out the rest of his life. Was in the community of Creston, which he was sort of known as the founder of that community. And of course, there's been other reenactments since then. There's one that was done at Craigellachie in 1958 during that anniversary, the centennial of BC. A bunch of local people did one in 1985 as well. So thanks for coming to today's talk. Just a reminder that, of course, we always welcome donations. You can call the museum at the number here to make a donation, or click the Donate Now button on our website. So thank you. We appreciate everybody's support. Our next Brown Bag History Talk is going to be on November 18th, and the subject will be automobiles from the early automotive history from the community. So thank you again for joining us. Appreciate you coming today.